Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of Amnulcus Bridge. In the 135th year of the Common Reckoning, Aristos led an army out of Midhaven, marching on Dogopolis, determined to recapture it from the Orcs. The core of the army was the heavy infantry, armoured men, with swords at their sides, bearing a shield in their left hand and a heavy javelin in their right. Aristos had 2 cohorts of these troops, each 100 strong. Accompanying them were 3 cohorts of unarmoured light infantry. All of these had a shield and a short sword. 2 cohorts supplemented this basic equipment with a sling, while the men of the third each clutched a handful of javelins. In addition, Aristos had managed to obtain sufficient horses to mount a cohort of armoured cavalry, carrying shields and armed with spears. This cavalry was Aristos' pride and joy, and was placed under the command of Nicatoris, who had risen from relative obscurity to fame and fortune following his victory at the Battle of the Dunes. The Dogopolitan troops under Aristos' command thus numbered some 600 men. Alongside them marched some 150 exiled Skeldings, grim-faced armoured infantry bearing shield and spear. They were commanded by Osric, a captain of the Skeldings, a man who had enjoyed hereditary wealth and power under King Gunlaf. All that had been lost when Anticlea had defeated the Skelding nobility on the battlefield and sacked Great Hall. Blamed for the Skeldings' defeat, despised and ridiculed accordingly, and reduced to poverty, Osric and others like him had followed Gunlaf's widowed queen, Adne, into exile. They fought for Aristos to restore their lost reputation for military competence, and to win the lands he had promised them, lands where they could make a new start. The Orcs regarded Aristos' attack on them as insolent and disrespectful. They flocked to the banner of Lobcag, the most powerful Orc in Dogopolis, who, mounted on a great wolf, rode out to meet Aristos at the head of some 800 armoured Orcan warriors. Across Aristos' road to Dogopolis ran the river Amnulcus, and the only way across the river Amnulcus was Amnulcus Bridge. As Aristos approached the bridge, his scouts informed him that the Orcan army was waiting on the far bank. Aristos had no desire to try and force a crossing. He preferred to sit back and let the Orcs come to him, giving him the opportunity to lash them with slingshot as they approached. He therefore drew up his forces along the ridge overlooking the river, and waited for the Orcs to make the next move, judging, correctly, that they would be impatient for a fight, and he would not have to wait for too long. Aristos placed his cavalry on his extreme right. Immediately to their left he placed a cohort of slingers. At this point there was a dip in the ridge, through which ran the road down to the bridge. In this dip Aristos placed a cohort of heavy infantry. On their left, back up on the ridge, he placed his second cohort of heavy infantry, which he commanded in person. Next came the Skelding spearmen, and on the far left of his line Aristos placed the second cohort of slingers. He stationed his cohort of javelin-men in front of the main line, screening the second cohort of heavy infantry and the Skeldings. The Orcs started to march over Amnulcus Bridge. Most carried 2-handed Orcan bills, but some were armed with sword and shield. Lobcag placed these at the head of the army, split into 2 groups, one to charge each cohort of Dogopolitan slingers, in the hope that their shields would provide them with some protection from Doggerpolitan's slingshot as they closed with their foes. As these warriors rushed forward, a long column of bill-armed orcs swarmed over the bridge in their wake. The slingers on the Doggerpolitan left flung slingshot into the Orcan warriors advancing toward them, and the first orcs started to fall. On the other side of the battlefield, the Doggerpolitan cavalry advanced down the slope, taking up a position on the flank of the advancing orcs. The cohort of slingers positioned behind the cavalry now let fly at the orcs advancing toward them, breaking the Orcan ranks and driving the orcs back in confusion. But still more and more orcs were rushing over the bridge and pushing up the centre. A group of bill-wielding orcs moved to their left, forming a screen to shield the army from the Doggerpolitan cavalry. The slingers continued to do their work, and the screening orcs suffered many casualties, but these were replaced as the slave masters drove those orcs who had previously retreated back into the line. And now Lobcag and the final group of orcs had crossed the bridge. On the Orcan right and in the centre, the leading groups of orcs were fast approaching the Doggerpolitan lines. The light infantry on the Doggerpolitan left let fly one last volley of slingshot into the orcs advancing up the hill toward them, before half of the Skelding spearmen, led by Osric in person, moved to the left to protect the vulnerable slingers. No sooner had the spearmen taken up their new position than the orcs were upon them, and a fierce hand-to-hand fight ensued. In the centre, the Skelding javelineers showered javelins down on the advancing orcs, but failed to slow their progress. And now, impatient to win more glory, Nicatoris led the Doggerpolitan cavalry charging into the screen of orcs confronting him. Some orcs were cut down, and others wavered in the face of the onrushing cavalry, but they maintained their cohesion and managed to hold the horsemen at bay. The cavalry fell back to regroup. In the centre, the leading orcs had now mounted the ridge and closed with the Doggerpolitan javelineers. The orcs used their bills to good effect, and, hard pressed, the javelineers fell back, seeking shelter behind the Skelding spearmen and Doggerpolitan heavy infantry situated to their rear. The Doggerpolitan cavalry charged once more, but this time the orcs stood firm, and the horsemen broke and fled. And up the road from the bridge came Lobcag and the final group of orcs, toward the gap in the ridge. The cohort of Doggerpolitan heavy infantry positioned there grasped the initiative and charged into the advancing orcs, hurling their heavy javelins as they did so. The fight was brutal. Lobcag's great wolf was struck down by a Doggerpolitan javelin. Lobcag was thrown from the saddle, and as he rose to his feet, he was wounded by a Doggerpolitan sword. As the battle surged around him, he fell to his knees, his blood flowing freely onto the trampled turf. And, in the confusion, one of his leading slaves, contemptuous of weakness, took the opportunity to win his freedom by removing his master's head. The death of Lobcag did not discourage the orcs. They fought all the harder. There was killing to be done, and he who proved himself the strongest would take Lobcag's place. The Doggerpolitans were driven back. Atop the ridge to the Doggerpolitan left, the orcs now crashed into the Skeldings that Osric had left holding the line while he defended the Doggerpolitan slingers. The Orcan sea surged forward, and the Skeldings died in droves. But not all the Skeldings perished so easily. On the Orcan right, Osric still held back the ravening horde, and now Aristos committed his cohort to the fray. In a cloud of heavy javelins, the last of the Dogopolitan heavy infantry thundered into the Orcan host confronting them. Many orcs were slain, but still their fellows came on. Aristos fought desperately for his life as Orcan bills cut down the men around him, and, having played his final card to no avail, he ordered the retreat to be sounded. While the Skelding spearmen fought on, the slingers on the Dogopolitan left fell back to join the javelineers in the centre. Aristos pulled what was left of his cohort back to join the few heavy infantry who were still defending the gap in the ridge, and the Dogopolitan slingers and cavalry on his right started to stream toward the rear. Seeing their allies deserting them, the surviving Skeldings, who had fought the orcs confronting them to a standstill, also disengaged and joined the general retreat. Aristos managed to hold his army together. His men marched from the field in good order, although they left many of their fellows dead or wounded behind them. Had the orcs pursued their foes, they might have turned an orderly withdrawal into a rout and won a decisive victory. But the orcs preferred to dispatch the helpless wounded and despoil the dead of both sides and squabble over the plunder, while the leading orcs fought over who would take Lobcag's place. Thus ended the Battle of Amnulcus Bridge.